There's something that I've been hearing a lot when companies start to struggle. They blame it on increased labor rights, rising labor costs, wages, staffing, or just kind of general work ethic. But when you look at the actual financials behind many major corporate collapses, the story is very different. Most of the time, the core issue isn't the workforce at all. It's debt, specifically large accumulated debt loads that companies can no longer sustain. Most large corporate debt is taken on intentionally during buyouts, expansions, or stock buyback cycles. The challenge is that debt makes companies extremely vulnerable. When consumer spending slows, or when interest rates rise, or when revenue dips even slightly, these companies suddenly find themselves completely unable to manage their obligation without maybe any sort of third-party investment, and that pressure leads to layoffs and closures, and in a lot of cases, bankruptcy. So, one of the clearest examples is Toys R Us. Public perception was that Amazon killed it, but that's just sort of the history that they'd like you to believe. After a private equity buyout, Toys R Us was saddled with roughly $5 billion in debt. The company was spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year just in interest payments. That money wasn't improving stores or modernizing anything or lowering prices. It was simply going to minimum payments. And as consumer behavior changed and margins tightened, that debt became just simply unsustainable. Another example is Bed Bath & Beyond. The chain struggled not because people suddenly stopped buying home goods, but because of its financial strategy. The company spent over $11 billion on stock buybacks over the years, and those buybacks reduced the company's financial flexibility. It increased reliance on the debt, so when sales declined and supply chain challenges appeared during COVID, they had very little room to adjust. The result was the store closures, layoffs, and eventually the complete bankruptcy, and it was driven not by labor costs, but by years of aggressive financial decisions. And Rite Aid offers another kind of more recent example. Headlines often point to the retail theft as the cause of the company's problems. But Rite Aid entered bankruptcy with more than $3 billion in debt. That was a burden that had existed long before theft had even become a talking point in the news. High interest payments severely constrained their ability to update stores or compete on pricing or invest in any kind of meaningful infrastructure. And we see the same thing with restaurants. Chains like Red Lobster, Chuck E. Cheese, TGI Fridays, and several others have, struggled or entered bankruptcy after years of being passed between lots of private equity owners. These companies just took on a large amount of debt during those ownership changes. And some had these really complex lease agreements too that put this extra boot on their neck. But when costs rose and consumer traffic declined, these chains weren't able to adapt. Not because the staff was too expensive, but just because their financial obligations made flexibility ultimately impossible. And here's sort of a simplified version of that cycle. A company is acquired or expands using borrowed money. That debt becomes the company's responsibility, the purchased company's responsibility. The interest payments consume a growing share of the revenue. Investment in stores and staff and technology gets delayed or just completely cut. The customer experience suffers, the revenue declines, and then debt becomes unmanageable, leading to closures or bankruptcy. And I think this cycle kind of starts at the top, if I can give a different example. An equity firm like Tri-Artesian has to increase the perceived value because they have a fiduciary responsibility to investors. So what do? They will purchase a well-known brand like TGI Fridays. They purchase the company for an exorbitant amount of money, typically borrowed. They pass that debt on to TGI Fridays as a company, making it economically unsustainable. Tri-Artesian wants to milk TGI Fridays for as long as possible, so they will make cuts to the quality and the customer experience until they can no longer realistically compete, and TGI files for bankruptcy and the debt is renegotiated, or they simply liquidate or sell. These brands aren't purchased with the intention of creating a robust business. It's just a manipulation of debt and essentially the investment market. So the issue is especially important now because the interest rates are rising, and companies that took on debt when borrowing was cheap are now facing much higher costs to maintain those loans. At the same time, many customers, especially young ones, are reducing discretionary spending. That combination puts enormous pressure on businesses that rely heavily on debt to operate and makes them prime targets for private equity firms to extract what's left while driving the company's reputation into the ground. And the financials just go into a complete early grave. When companies cut jobs or close locations, executives point to wages or staffing as the problem, but in many cases, those decisions are symptoms, not causes. The deeper issue is the financial structure, in my opinion. How much debt the company carries, how it was acquired, and whether it invested in long-term sustainability or short-term gains. So as more companies announce layoffs and restructuring, it's worth asking a simple question. Is this really about wages or labor? Also, I think the same thing applies to the layoffs due to AI. I'm skeptical that the layoffs are really because of AI replacement. I think that needs to be a separate video because that's mostly the tech that's laying people off, and I think there's a few different things happening there, in my opinion. But ultimately, it's the same scapegoating that applies, I think. But I've just noticed since COVID that the discourse around closures and low quality consumer experiences has been centered around wages and work ethic, and I think that's just unfair. And it's also not the accurate picture.